Title lecture is Humanae Vitae, Catholics, Contraception, and the Church in Crisis, 1930 to 1970. So I'm going to talk about things that happened that led to this conflict over the church's teaching on contraception. If you don't know, by the way, Humanae Vitae was the encyclical issued by Pope Paul VI in 1968, which reaffirmed the church's prohibition of any acts of artificial contraception as immoral. And a couple of things about the lecture before I dive in here. What I'm going to show you is, for the most part, the church is a global institution, but it's mostly going to focus on Western Europe and the United States. That's where the bulk of the resistance to Humanae Vitae came from. That's what I know better than anything else. I say this because I think there are going to be some people, I have friends who are from other countries, might be watching this. I'm not leaving you out on purpose. It's different in different countries, and the bulk of this controversy takes place in Western Europe and the United States. That'll be the focus here. So let me get into this real quick. So I want to start out with a question, right? And the question, I thought the best way to go through this is to show you this image from a Pew Forum survey. Pew Forum on Religious Life is a organization in the United States that does surveys of religious opinions amongst Americans. And this is an American survey, but you can give an idea just how widespread this is, extrapolating from this. And it surveyed in 2016, Pew Forum surveyed Christians in America about their views on certain things. You can see here is contraceptives, abortion, and homosexual behavior. And I've highlighted for our purposes, the relevant portions here. Among all Catholics, you can see right here, 8% think that contraceptives are morally wrong, according to the survey. 41% think they're morally acceptable. 48% say it's not a moral issue at all. When you come down here, they also ask people if they attended worship services once a week. So for those who attend weekly or more, Catholics, that means go to Mass once a week. The numbers change slightly. 13% of Mass-going Catholics, weekly Mass-going Catholics, think artificial contraceptives are wrong. 45% say it's morally acceptable, and then 42% say it's not a moral issue. So the question is, the church still has always basically taught, we'll get into this, that any sort of artificial frustration of conception is immoral. So the question is, okay, how did we get to this point? From, presumably, we'll go into this, that used to be not this way. So how did this come about? And that's what the lecture is going to be about here. So I want to begin with a graph. As you'll see, I'll end with a graph or a chart. I want to talk about some broad changes that happened in the 20 or so years prior to Humanae Vitae being issued, because there were lots of things that, it's kind of complicated, that led into people just sort of Catholic belief collapsing in this doctrine. And in fact, there was a sociologist of religion back in the 1960s, a man named Peter Berger, who came up with this theory that he called plausibility structures. He was trying to explain why certain religious beliefs die out, why they not only die out, but why they come to seem unbelievable to the adherents of a particular religion. And so what I'm kind of talking about here is why all of a sudden, in the years leading up to Humanae Vitae, that increasingly the church's teaching not seem plausible to people, to Catholics. And the first thing I want to talk about is the world wars, World War I and World War II. And now I'm starting 1945 here. I think it's very likely the wars had a big impact on this for a couple of reasons. Reasons you may not think about, but wars pretty much always lead to an uptick in, well, how can I put this? Premarital sex, or sex outside of marriage. Why is this? This is because during wartime, you have a bunch of young men sent off to war who get exposed to, well, opportunities for non-marital sex they would not have in their own lives. If you know the song, the World War I era song from America, how are you going to keep them down on the farm when they've seen Paris, right? That's referring to how you're going to keep them at home when they've had opportunities for non-marital sex, basically is what that song's alluding to. And we have hard evidence of this, by the way, that, for example, during World War I in France, for example, among the French population, rates of venereal disease, rates of out of wedlock births shot up during that war. We have anecdotal evidence. Germain Grisey, who was a theologian who defended Humanae Vitae later in the 60s, recalled being told by priests that during the war in Europe, priests had sort of let let couples contracept because of the circumstances of the war. Things were hectic, and then it came to be seen as acceptable after the war because of that in certain areas. So there's definitely this sort of thing going on, I think. In the United States is a definite, by the way, a definite, I think, connection between the two world wars and changes in ideas and attitudes about sex. Right after the war was over in the United States in 1948, if you know what I'm talking about, Alfred Kinsey, who was a long story, issued a report, an infamous report, surveying American attitudes, or American, at least self-reported attitudes and sexual practices. There are problems with the actual survey. It probably wasn't that accurate, but the fact that somebody was actually invested in that to do that in 1948 suggested that there was some connection there, I think. And just the dominance of veterans in American life suggests this after World War II. It's hard for us to remember, but we had a president in the 1950s, Dwight Eisenhower, who was a World War II general. Half the congressmen in Congress by the middle 1950s were former veterans. And in things like fashion and movies and stuff like this, the culture was dictated by what you might think of as being sort of barrack room fantasies about women. The best example of this, by the way, being Hugh Hefner, who founds Playboy in 1953. If you don't know, Hugh Hefner spent 3 years in the Army during World War II, from 44 to 46. He didn't see combat. I don't even think he went overseas. He may have gone to Korea, I think. But he got exposed to, again, that's what the Playboy basically is sort of a grunt soldier barracks wet dream about what women are like. And so this gets into the culture well before, I think my point here, well before the 1960s. It wasn't very prominent because there were taboos about talking about this stuff in public life in the 1950s. But my point is, this didn't begin with the baby boomers in the 1960s. In fact, almost all people I'll talk about in this lecture who were involved in the controversy over the church's teaching, they're born before World War II, born before the baby boom. Even though the boomers, as I'll get to in a second, have something to do with this, they're part of their parents' generations were part of this. So that's the first thing. Second thing is demographic changes and the population control movement. There was a worldwide baby boom following World War II, which unleashed a disproportionately large cohort of teenagers upon the world. And as you know, teenagers they like sex. And when you have such a big cohort, again, especially in the United States, demography is destiny. Demography is power. So, advertisers, businesses, politicians, TV executives begin catering to that demographic who is younger, again, more into things that young people are into, like sex. They also, by the way, the baby boomers spend more years in educational institutions than their parents did. And this is important because you're having students in the 1960s, again, in which there is a huge swelling of enrollment numbers in universities across the Western world, United States, Western Europe. So you have more kids being more exposed to ideas that are probably antithetical to the church's beliefs about sexuality. But even more than this, an important part of the story I'm going to tell you tonight is about this population control movement. Growing world population after World War II led to fears of scarcity, and as a very, very technocratic sort of population control movement, which was spearheaded by international institutions like the United Nations, NGOs, philanthropic organizations, which I'll come to some of these in a moment, as well as other think tanks and stuff like this, as well as governments, began to sponsor initiatives in developing countries promoting contraception and sterilization with the intention of trying to reduce their population. Governments increasingly, and they have since then, tied aid to these countries to population control. One example, after reading a study by a population control advocate in 1965, Lyndon Baines Johnson, the President of the United States, cut off aid to India, saying that, quote, "I'm not going to piss away foreign aid in nations where they refuse to deal with their own population problems," unquote. Lyndon was a real sweetheart, by the way. And then finally, the year that Humanae Vitae was issued in 1968, Paul Ehrlich, you know who that is, it's kind of an infamous name, Stanford scholar who published a book called The Population Bomb, predicting that in a few years, if drastic measures weren't taken, millions of people would die across the globe and there'd be overpopulation, all of other stuff. None of those predictions came true, by the way. It's completely nonsense in a lot of regards. But it's a very powerful force among world leaders in the period running up to Humanae Vitae. Other things that make a difference are technological developments. And in fact, one thing that runs through, again, my own looking at this in preparation for the lecture was just the belief, especially among Americans, in the, I don't know how to put this, the faith they have in technology. I guess we still do. Americans do. They think technology is like going to save us or something. But you have innovations that change social life. One that's kind of not talked about, this is historians talk about this stuff, specialists, is that that affected housewives, especially in America, well, the development of, well, time-saving appliances, vacuum cleaners, stuff like this, refrigerators, things you take for granted now, was a huge change. And it was a change because before the 1950s, if you're middle class, you'd probably have a maid do all the cooking and cleaning and stuff if you had of a certain class. Well, by the 1950s, you didn't need that because they've been replaced by, you know, automated technology, right? Technology is great. But this, oddly enough, meant that middle-class housewives were doing more work, more housework than ever before, because now they had to do it all, essentially. So it's kind of one of the, I say this because there's going to be a lot of the push among the laity in the 1960s for the church to alter its teachings and allow for the use of artificial contraception comes from married women. And this is, again, it puts a lot of pressure because women are also, if you don't know, by the end of the 1950s, increasingly entering the workforce in greater numbers. So this will be a weighing on people's minds. Television, of course, reshapes the landscape in the 1950s. It can broadcast, you know, sexualized images to a larger audience. And again, one thing to keep in mind, today, across the globe, you have lots of options if you want to watch TV. You don't have to watch sexualized images if you want. In the 1950s in America, there were 3 TV channels. In Europe, most places, you had one state-run television station. So, and TV becomes a powerful force in public life. But the most important thing, of course, some of you probably know this already, is that in 1960, the first oral contraceptive goes to market. And it is effectively the first truly reliable form of artificial contraception ever invented. And this will change things out of all proportion. This is the dividing line. That really things begin to heat up in terms of the controversy of the church's teaching because of this in 1960. And then finally, as you get toward the early 1960s, you're beginning to have the erosion of public taboos of discussion about things like sexuality. Sex is a forbidden subject for a lot of people up to the early 1960s. And the fact that it begins to happen around about the same time Humanae Vitae is promulgated is one of the reasons why the reaction is the way it is, I think. There was actually it was an explosive thing, by the way, to go from never talking about sex in public, all of a sudden it's everywhere. And there was a poet, Philip Larkin, a good poet actually, who wrote a poem in 1967 in which he, the first stanza of this poem says, I'm reading this here, a quote, "Sexual intercourse began in 1963 between the end of the Chatterley Ban and the Beatles' first LP." And if you don't know, and by the way, he's being tongue-in-cheek. When he says sexual intercourse began in 1963, he means, again, it became something, a reality you talked about in a way it had never been talked about before. And just to follow up my point, by the way, he says the Chatterley Ban, that line I read, the Chatterley Ban refers to the banning of D.H. Lawrence's novel Lady Chatterley's Lover in Britain. It had been banned in the 1950s. The Supreme Court struck it down that ban in 1963. This begins to happen in America, late 1950s. You're beginning to have bans on pornography struck down by the Supreme Court. Those taboos are beginning to erode at the same time. Humanae Vitae and the church's teaching is coming under scrutiny. So all these things lead to the erosion of those plausibility structures that I just talked about there. And here's just a couple of nice images to show you, because we're going to get to this in a moment, about how contraception comes into people's mentality. Filling Contraception 1923-1960. On the left, you have an image. This is the Birth Control Review, which was edited by Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, in 1923. And you can kind of see, and she's the founder of the birth control. We'll talk about this in a second. But you see the image there of how she's selling birth control / contraception. You have a woman standing there looking distraught, and then behind her, a chain with a ball on the end of it says unwanted babies. On the right-hand side, you have one of the first ads for the quote-unquote the pill, the first oral contraceptive, which is actually called Innovid. And you can see there's an ad, and I can't remember which magazine this is in. And it's very interesting the way that they talk about this. If you can't read all this, it's kind of interesting. The first comprehensive, truly feminine regulator of cyclic function. Apparently, one of the fears of women was that it would make them masculine if they took stuff like this. But look what it says down here. For maximal efficiency and safety in regulating menstrual cyclic function, a steroid compound, There's an emphasis in these advertisements, if you read through this stuff, on the efficiency, on technocratic control in these ads. It's very interesting. But also note this image. You probably can't see it too well up here. You probably see a woman in chains. That's actually a woman breaking out of her chains, if you can see it up close. And in fact, this is a reference. If you know your Greek mythology, here's the time to use it. This is actually a picture of Andromeda. And if you don't know, Andromeda in the Greek myth is actually chained to a rock and rescued by Perseus. Of course, in this image, she's rescuing herself by breaking out of her chains. My point of bringing these two pictures together is that contraceptions begin to be sold as personal liberation for women in the early 20th century. And so that's what we're going to get into here. And specifically with the church and the birth control movement. And one of the things about this is that the whole idea of a birth control movement would have been unthinkable prior to the modern era, beginning about 1800 or so. Partly because the problem before then was people died at such high rates, you didn't want to restrain births, you wanted to have more of them. But with the coming of industrialization, where you have all of a sudden birth rates shoot up, and the advent of modern medicine, you begin to have almost immediately, starting in 1800 or so, the first movements to limit family sizes. In fact, even before 1800, the first widespread use of contraception we know of in Western history anyway, is in France in the latter part of the 18th century. In 1799, 98, Thomas Malthus, an English clergyman of the Church of England, publishes an essay on population, which is very influential in a lot of areas, in which he basically advocates for the government to start helping people limit their family size. He's afraid, this is his idea, is that population tends to outstrip food supply. He doesn't advocate, by the way, artificial contraception. He's an Anglican clergyman. But his followers pretty quickly begin to do so. In fact, in 1822, a man named Francis Place, who was one of his followers, became the first person I'm aware of in any Christian country in history to advocate artificial contraception as if it were a good thing. This is one of the things, again, the background here, no Christian body, no Christian church ever had given approval to contraception before the 20th century. We'll get to that in a moment. And so it's still widely condemned. Even though Malthus's ideas have a following, by the latter part of the 19th century, you have so-called Malthusian leagues spring up first in Britain and elsewhere in Europe, who are dedicated to reducing population. They promote artificial contraception. By the way, one of the reasonings was that the primary cause of overpopulation was the cause of poverty, so they wanted to eliminate poverty. It was put in humanitarian terms. However, most governments didn't buy this, and in fact, as soon as this became widely known, people reacted against it. In the United States, the so-called Comstock laws were passed in the 1870s, whereby information about sex and contraceptives was prohibited from being sent through the U.S. mail system. This was the Senator Anthony Comstock who did this. At the same time, beginning in the 1880s, the hierarchy, the Catholic hierarchy in many Western countries, began insisting that confessors make inquiries about this, about whether couples were using contraception if they had valid suspicions. And you had them issuing statements in Belgium in the 1880s, Germany, France, United States by 1920 have also all issued public statements condemning the use of contraception. At the same time, however, you're beginning to have, especially the early 1900s, turn of the century, the so-called science of eugenics gaining a following among a lot of people, actually. And they're going to be not just people in the churches, and there are actually a lot of them, not the Catholic Church, but the Protestant ones in America, but also philanthropic organizations, Carnegie Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation. If you don't know who those names are, those are big robber barons during the late 19th century. They'll become heavily invested in population control, and they'll be part of this. As well, by the 1920s, the ideas of Sigmund Freud, which he published about sexuality prior to World War I, have become accepted widely in elite circles, academics, literary types, so on and so forth. And throughout Europe and the United States in the interwar period, you're going to have movements to promote birth control. In 1919, a scientist, so-called, founded in Germany the Institute for Sexual Research in Berlin, which is part of the so-called sex reform movement in the Weimar Republic of Germany, which besides promoting contraceptions, also pushed for the legalization of abortion, which their campaign didn't work, but it came close. 1921, Marie Stopes opened the first birth control clinic in Britain. The same year, Margaret Sanger started the birth control league in the United States. And by the way, Margaret Sanger was actually funded in part by the Rockefeller Foundation. She was given a grant by the Rockefeller Foundation. In the 1930s, you begin to have you have the publication by the psychiatrist Wilhelm Reich of several books which effectively push. Well, he actually invents the term sexual revolution. He publishes a book. It's actually originally called in German Sex and the Culture War, key to its title, but it gets published in the United States in 1945 as The Sexual Revolution, where he's literally a disciple of Freud. He knew Freud. He linked personal neuroses to sexual repression, and sexual repression to the capitalist state as well as the patriarchal family. So if you're ever wondering where this idea comes from, that sexual repression and the patriarchy go together, it comes from this interwar period and people like Wilhelm Reich. And this is actually a big change because prior to World War I, population control, contraception, birth control, whatever you want to put it, had originally been sold, and actually it still is in private. They don't say it in public as much anymore. It was originally sold as a way of limiting the population of poor people. There is, at least from what I've read about this stuff, there's a real class, there's class stuff going on here. This is mostly wealthy or upper middle class people wanting to reduce the population of poor people. Margaret Sanger, if you don't know, that was one of her key principles, was to limit the number of people who were, quite frankly, undesirable. This is why, by the way, people like George Orwell, of all people, who was an atheist, was opposed to contraception. He thought it was a upper class conspiracy against the working class. But what happens in the 1920s, and will come to play after World War II especially, is the idea of contraceptives being liberating for middle class women. In other words, it goes from being, oh, let's control the poor people, to let's help middle class people. So there's a shift in the justification for it. And this all comes to head for the church, if you're wondering, or get to all this, because I'm focusing, by the way, so much on wider things, because the movement to push the church into accepting this comes from outside, doesn't come from inside the church. In 1930, something momentous happened. 1930, the Church of England, the official Protestant church, state church of Britain, became the first Christian body in history to approve the use of artificial contraceptives for married couples. It was pitched again as a sort of, it was an exception. It wasn't going to be, it wasn't just for everybody. Within a couple of decades, virtually every Protestant denomination, as far as I'm aware, in the world, had come to accept, either in practice or even mostly in practice. They didn't come out and say it, but they'd effectively accepted it as normal by the late 1950s. So within 20, 30 years, this has all shifted radically in the Protestant world. I should mention, by the way, as far as I'm aware, The Orthodox churches have never accepted this, so they more or less kept to the ancient teaching. But the decision of the Anglican Church worried Rome, and so in 1930, Pope Pius XI issued Casti Connubi, papal encyclical on marriage. That's what those words mean, chaste marriage, which reaffirmed the traditional Christian teaching on marriage that was primarily for procreation and family. He basically reaffirmed the church's teaching that I'm going to read a quotation here in a minute. Quote, any use whatsoever of matrimony exercised in such a way that the act is deliberately frustrated in its natural power to generate life is an offense against the law of God and of nature, and those who indulge in such are branded with the guilt of a grave sin, unquote. And so from that time all forward until the 1960s, the church began to make greater efforts to try to respond to all these movements to get make contraceptives acceptable to people. And particularly in the United States, they actually had some success with this. This is what I know best, so I'll talk about it here. The historian Leslie Tentler discovered syllabi in the archives of the Archdiocese of Detroit, and syllabi of sermon topics where priests were supposed to preach on all these topics at least once in a year, and they were expected to and did preach on at least once a year on contraception. And in fact, many priests did, but a lot of priests did actually get religious orders to do this during parish missions. You know, parish missions are a thing, but you have people come in, usually religious orders come in and give talks on stuff. And in fact, according to Janet Smith, who's a scholar and a defender of Humanae Vitae, they actually had a specific day, most of these parish missions did, set aside to talk about sex. It was Wednesday. It was called Sex Day. Well, I thought it was kind of funny, but it was something people talked about. And this bore some fruit. By the 1950s in the United States, according to one survey, in 1955, a survey of American Catholic wives between the ages of 18 and 30 found that 70% had conformed to the church teaching and never thought about using contraceptives. This, by the way, dropped to 62% by 1960. But still, you have in a Protestant country surrounded by people who are using contraception, you had the church basically holding the line, partly because in the United States, I don't know about other countries, you're having the sense that this is a Catholic doctrine now. Again, this used to be something all denominations embraced. There's a sort of rallying around the flag effect to a certain degree in the 50s. But moreover, you have theologians trying to respond to criticisms of the church's teaching. You have them beginning to present the church's teaching in more personalist terms, putting emphasis on mutual love. In fact, actually, Pius XI does this in Casti Connubi. I'll come back to this in a moment. And in fact, in 1960, that's when Karol Wojtyła, the future John Paul II, first publishes his book, Love and Responsibility. So you have people trying to respond to people's concerns. In the 1950s, again, Pope Pius XII, also reiterates the church's teaching while approving the use of the sterile period for couples with quote unquote serious economic, medical, or social reasons. And so you have, and this is I'll talk some more, this is a development because the church hadn't done this until Casti Connubi, but this is the rhythm method, of course. This is where you try to use we'll get to this in a moment. This is the precursor to NFP, if you know what that is. And there seemed to be, at least officially, a big consensus as late as 1962. As late as that period, you have an article in the Jesuit journal Theological Studies, which proclaimed that moral theologians were unanimous that steroid-based contraceptives, that's what the pill was, were against natural law. So up to the early 1960s, it seemed like things were holding steady. However, there was already sort of change in the air, in the offing. In fact, Pius XII, he gave a couple of talks about this in the 1950s. He was reacting to changes in moral theology in the 1950s. By the early 50s, you already had some theologians trying to assert that a newer, more improved understanding of human nature and his control, especially over his biological nature, based on modern experiences, et cetera, required a revision in the church's teaching on natural law. I usually get complaints like, I don't have time to go into this, but complaints that the church's teaching was too legalistic. It emphasized negative prohibitions too much. It wasn't sensitive to people's experiences. There was also, and this will be prominent in the reaction to Humanae Vitae, questions began to arise as to whether the church's teachings could change on this. Because again, up until the 1960s until 1930, nobody had thought it could change at all. And in fact, by the early 60s, you begin to have Catholic scholars basically writing books proclaiming that it can change. 1964, the intellectual historian Louis Dupre wrote a book, Contraception in Catholics, arguing that it could. But more important, that was the book published by John Noonan Jr., 1965, Contraception, A History of Theologians. I shared a photo on my Facebook page the other day, but John Noonan's book was really important. John Noonan, by the way, since passed away, was a federal judge, a very prominent legal scholar. And he argued that the church's teaching on contraception was reformable. Now, I want to apologize to everybody. I didn't get a chance to read the book. I was going to, but because of the lockdown, I couldn't get access to books anymore, but I got enough of a sense of it from reading other things around it. He acknowledges in his introduction, does John Noonan, that the church had never taught that artificial contraception was morally acceptable. So, and in fact, pretty much always had. Like, anytime the church had addressed it, it was pretty much any act of frustrating natural conception was wrong. I don't know of any. I do not know of any Catholic theologian, saint, doctor of the church ever taught otherwise. His argument went like this. He claimed that even though the church had consistently said this was wrong, he claimed that the specific justifications for the prohibition had changed over time. I confess I don't know what he's talking about. It always seemed the same to me, but more importantly, this is the other big argument he makes that people are really convinced by. He says that in other areas, other long-held teachings of the church had changed, and he gives 3 examples. And I don't have time to go into these, but I'll just go through this here. Those on slavery, the church had once accepted it, starts to condemn it in the 19th century, so goes his argument. Usury, church had condemned charging interest on loans for poor people, but came to accept it in the modern era. And the third one, this actually goes back to the Second Vatican Council on religious freedom. The idea that it had condemned it before, now it accepted it. I don't have time to go into it on all those. I don't buy any of those arguments, by the way, but you can make good arguments for them, even though I don't find them convincing. I think they're mostly superficial, but you can do it. It convinced a lot of people that yes, this thing wasn't reformable. This thing was reformable. Plus, by the early 1960s, Catholic women were already starting to use the pill, and Catholic laywomen increasingly, from the early 1960s onward, wrote into Catholic magazines and Catholic newspapers and calling for this to be approved. A lot of them complained about the frustration they had with the rhythm method, which didn't seem to actually regulate births. They talked about how trying to be abstinent caused friction in their marriages because their husbands wanted to have sex. According to one laywoman, Carolyn Schabelhut, 1964, wrote a letter to an editor, in which she wrote, quote, "To me and many Catholics, rhythm is a manifestation of an attitude of many clergymen looking down from their pedestals, offering us glib platitudes in the letter of the law without seeing our real problems," unquote. There was a growing sense that the church didn't understand people's experiences, and therefore this is why they had to sort of do this. More important, I think, than this, at an institutional level, there was a serious campaign by birth control advocates to woo Catholic leaders, mostly through things like philanthropic grants and money for education. Institutions like the Population Council, which was founded in 1951 by John D. Rockefeller. The Rockefeller Foundation, of course, provided money for this stuff. By 1962, Planned Parenthood began to make inroads into Catholic churches. They sent representatives, for example, to the National Catholic Family Life Convention in St. Louis that year in '62, and made contact with family life directors in parishes. They'd already sent representatives to Europe, to Catholic universities like Louvain in Belgium, to try to sway them, people like this. 1960, also the next year, 1963, Dr. John Rock was a gynecologist from Harvard and also a Catholic, had a book published by Planned Parenthood called, quote, "The Time Has Come, a Catholic Doctor's Proposals to End the Battle Over Birth Control." And he made big hay out of the fact that he was a practicing Catholic, and basically calling for an end to the church's prohibition. He actually testified before the U.S. Senate the next year, in 1965, I should say, that he was completely confident that the church would eventually change its teaching on birth control. A survey of American Catholics, in fact, in 1966, found that 61% expected the church to alter its teaching on contraception. And then finally, probably maybe the most important driver of this, one of the more important ones, I mentioned the Rockefeller Foundation. John D. Rockefeller III got permission of Theodore Hesburgh, who was the president of Notre Dame University, father of Theodore Hesburgh. And they organized a series of private meetings from '63 to '67, sponsored by the Rockefeller and the Ford Foundation. By the way, the Ford Foundation also heavily invested in things like population control. That's Henry Ford, the founder of Ford Motors. And these private meetings with Catholic leaders, along with leaders from Planned Parenthood, Population Council, Ford, Rockefeller Foundations, they met with the purpose of convincing Catholic leaders to change the church's teaching on birth control. According to Donald Critchlow, who's a historian, wrote a book about this, the Rockefeller and other people saw this as an opportunity to, quote, help change opinion within the hierarchy, unquote. And according to George Schuster, who was the, or at least his biographer, who was the personal assistant of Theodore Hesburgh, the aim of all these conferences was, quote, to create an oppositional voice within the Catholic Church on the issue of family planning, unquote. According to Donald Critchlow, Father Hesburgh even arranged for a meeting between Pope Paul VI and John D. Rockefeller in 1965. According to one source that I read in this, at that meeting, John Rockefeller actually offered to ghostwrite an encyclical reversing the church's teaching for Paul VI. Apparently, he was there to pressure Paul VI into changing the teaching, if I gather from what I gathered from this. And then finally, 1967, 65, excuse me, 37 scholars who attended one of those conferences at Notre Dame signed a confidential statement, sending it to the Vatican, basically lobbying for a change, asking for a change in the church's view of contraception. By the way, for all of his efforts, Theodore Hesburgh was actually appointed to the board of directors of the Rockefeller Foundation. So there was a definite use of money, in other words, to pry the church's leaders to try to change church teaching this way. So this is all within a few years, right up to the point where Humanae Vitae gets issued. But for a couple of moments, I want to talk about Casti Connubi. You can kind of see here you have this, I don't actually know what year this is from, but you can see this is from, I believe it says St. Catherine's Novitiate, Dominican Sisters, Kenosha, Wisconsin. American translation of Casti Connubi. If you read down there too, it says with discussion club outline. So again, there were efforts to sort of promote the church's teaching back then. What did it teach? I want to go into this real quickly because Casti Connubi is important. It's mostly about marriage. There's actually not a whole, it's not the whole thing, it's not about contraception. But it says several things that are interesting. One is it affirms the traditional teaching that all acts, again, there's some mitigating circumstances to this, but all acts frustrating conception are sinful. But, and this is something he actually says, it surprised me when reading it, it is not a sin if for a grave reason, if one has tried to dissuade one's spouse. He actually says, you read Casti Connubi, which you should. He says he realizes that in these issues that sometimes one is more one part of the couple is more sinned against than sinning. If you try to get your spouse to follow the teaching and he refuses, and in other words, there's the lack of culpability there. In other words, it's not, again, there's some nuance. This is my point. A lot of times you have people criticize the church for being legalistic. They understood people had problems. Even back in the Stone Ages in 1930. He also approved use of the infertile period, rhythm method, didn't use that term, for serious purposes for the first time. This was the first time in the church's history it had ever said anything but abstinence was the only way until 1930. While reaffirming that children were the primary end of marriage, he also mentioned mutual love as a secondary purpose of marital lovemaking, obviously. And so it is, again, it did try to affirm the church's teachings while trying to take into account people's experiences. So it's not true that it didn't. So how do we get to Humanae Vitae and the big blow up? Okay, so 1958, Pius XII dies, and Pope John XXIII is elected in his stead as Pope. If you know who he is, he's the one who, of course, calls Vatican II, which begins in 1962. By the time you get to the early 1960s, there's a lot of rumblings about the church's teaching. John XXIII, in 1963, before he dies that year, appoints a commission for the study of the problems of family, population, and birth rate. Now, I mention this because to this day, people, when you read histories of this, will say, well, he did it so the church could examine its teaching. Church could do this. Janet Smith, I mentioned her before, did a serious study of Humanae Vitae about 30 years ago. And she claimed that she could never find anywhere any published document, any published statement as to what exactly the purpose of this commission was. No one really knows. People assume, by the way, they were examining it to see if they could change it. That's why I'm mentioning that. We don't know if that's the case. In fact, the United Nations, the reason they may have created this commission was that same year, 1963, the United Nations had invited the Holy See to participate in an international conference on population to be held in India. And this may have been a response to this. This, by the way, like world population and its problems, was a big concern of John XXIII's successor, Pope Paul VI. He actually wrote an encyclical on the problems of modern society in 1967 called Populorum Progressio, where he talked briefly about population problems. My point about this, by the way, in mentioning this commission, if you don't know anything about how the Vatican works, most of their commissions they're private. They're kind of off limits to the public. The Vatican, and it has every right, by the way, to have some privacy for its deliberations. This was a problem, and I say this because by not telling people what it was about, it allowed people to sort of speak in the church's name and say, hey, look, the commission's studying the church's teaching. They're going to change it. This really was, I think, a mistake by the papacy, is my point, even though I have no idea why they did that. In fact, to this day, I think the church has, at a local level, definitely at a papal level, a problem with trying to be transparent. I get that they need to have some privacy, but they still have not learned that if you don't let, in this day and age, you can't just let people say whatever they want because they're going to say whatever they want. You can't control that. What you can do is get your own story out there, and it didn't even bother to try to do this. This, I think, was a big mistake. And in fact, most of the documentation, by the way, that was produced by this commission has never been released. So keep all that stuff in mind. Whatever its rationale, as it came to start discuss things in 1963, the majority of the people on this commission started to focus on contraception and began to debate it as if that were the purpose that they were there for. And I should mention, by the way, the makeup of this commission was very historic. The Pope appointed a large number of laymen to this commission, gynecologists, psychiatrists, doctors, family life directors from parishes. There were 2 married couples on this committee. And they were very influential, as I'll get to in a moment. By the way, reason why I say that's historic, I don't mean to suggest everything was this way, but the pre-Vatican II church could be very, what's the word I'm looking for? They didn't necessarily take laymen's concerns seriously. And the fact they appointed that many laymen to this commission, again, it kind of signaled to people, hey, they're taking our concern seriously for the first time. Again, my point is I think it raised expectations about what the commission was there for. And in fact, as they began to debate, and in fact, they changed, by the way, I want to say, debating, okay, what about the church teaching on marriage, to debating, okay, it's teaching on contraception, to very quickly going to, is it reformable? And in fact, the Pope enlarged the membership of the commission several times, apparently with a view to sort of putting a stop to all this. He actually added several bishops and cardinals to the commission. The commission did work for 3 years and issued its final findings to the Pope in 1966. I say final, it wasn't actually a document that had consensus, it was just the final findings that they provided to the Pope. They did vote at the end of the commission on whether or not the church should change its teaching. And of the 69 members of the commission, 64 voted in favor of the church allowing artificial contraception, including 15 of 19 theologians, and these numbers don't add up. Anyway, whatever. 15 of 19 theologians, and more importantly, 9 of the 15 bishops and cardinals voted in favor of this. 9 were in favor of changing it, 3 were against, and 3 abstained. There was one other person who couldn't come to the meeting who would have voted against it. That's Karol Wojtyła. The communist government of Poland wouldn't give him a visa to go, but the majority of the people, vast majority on the commission, voted that yes, it should change. And one of the things to note about this, by the way, I mentioned the makeup of the commission. Later, after it was over, those who voted for change among the clergy, such as Cardinal Suenens of Belgium, who's a progressive cardinal from Belgium, they claimed that the testimony of medical experts and laymen, especially married women, was decisive for them in changing their minds about the ban. Again, you have to remember, a lot of these cardinals and bishops probably they'd never talked to women about this stuff in their lives. They never heard what the problems were, right? Strained relations with husbands, depression, stuff like this, problems from multiple pregnancies, things like that. Conversely, one of the lay members of the commission, John D. Kavanaugh, a psychiatrist, later told Germain Grisey, a theologian, that most of the lay people had come to Rome on the commission, totally opposed to contraception. But they changed their minds once they heard theologians and clergy saying it was possible. And again, I can't emphasize this to you enough. I don't think most lay people would have gotten into their heads that the church could change its teachings if there hadn't been clergy telling them they could. Seems to me pretty clear. And influential, by the way, theologians changed their minds. Joseph Fuchs was probably the most important one here. He was a Jesuit theologian who had been totally opposed to contraception before he came to Rome. All of a sudden, he changed his mind during the commission. This had a dramatic effect because virtually everybody in the Jesuit order followed him. Not everybody, but a lot of people did. He was that influential in changing people's minds. And so they issued their findings to Paul VI in 1966. But, and this is where there's things going on behind the scenes, the documents they gave him cited changes in church teaching in other areas as a precedent for doing this, particularly on things like usury and freedom of conscience. I'll go some other things here, but big thing they did is that a few of these members leaked copies of some of these documents that were supposed to be off limits to the public. They leaked them to the press, to the National Catholic Reporter right here in Kansas City, to the Tablet in England, a couple other places in 1967, which caused a stir because it seemed to be, oh look, the church is going to be changing its teachings. And I'm going to go over this in a second, because it makes was one of the documents that is involved in this oppo dumpus, which is basically what it is, was a document called Schema for a Responsible Parenthood. This is what everybody calls the majority report. This is why again, it actually technically wasn't. That document, the Schema for a Responsible Parenthood, was written by 4 of the theologians who were in favor of the change, but they got it depicted as that in the press. And by the way, they leaked the documents in order to pressure Paul VI into changing the teaching. It backfired, as you'll see, but that's what they did it. But they made basically 6 arguments in this document of why the church could and should change its teaching. I'll go through these one by one here. One is that in modern life, modern circumstances rendered absolute moral prohibitions impossible. And therefore, complete abstinence in marriage was impossible. Therefore, it was too much to ask couples to abstain from sex, basically. Secondly, past teaching on contraception was obsolete now because of new scientific knowledge. 3, not every marital act needs to be open to life, because the morality of sexual act doesn't depend on following nature. It depends on mutual love. Love before nature, basically. 4, acts are not wrong because they stifle nature, but because not every I guess I put this in different terms here. Not every act of contraception is immoral, because man's nature is to control nature. I'll come back to this and show you the actual words they use, but basically saying that mankind has control of nature, and therefore they don't have to follow the biological processes as if it was some sort of law laid down by God. 5th, the use of contraceptives should be up to the couples with rightly formed consciences, and there are no rules that apply in all cases. And then finally, number 6, that this change is in continuity with the church's tradition on contraception, which was probably the most presumptuous thing they said in that report. Now, when this thing was released, one of the prelates, cardinals who voted against the change, Cardinal Taviani, asked an American Jesuit named John Ford to stay in Rome and write a response to the commission's report. Eventually, Taviani got a meeting with Pope Paul VI and presented it to him. And later on, Father Ford was given an audience with Pope Paul VI to make his case as to why the church why he should reject the commission's report. According to Father Ford, he told a story that at one point in one of these talks, he asked him, I'm quoting here, "Are you ready to say that Casti Connubi can be changed?" Paul came alive and spoke with vehemence. I'm quoting his words here. "No," he said. He reacted exactly as though I was calling him a traitor to his Catholic belief, unquote. Long story short, it was basically the efforts of Cardinal Taviani, Father Ford, and a few other people that convinced Paul VI to resist all this. And in fact, the document, of course, that will become Humanae Vitae will reaffirm the church's teaching. And so I'm calling them minority because that's what they get called in the press, but it's a handful of people that basically sort of buoyed up Paul VI to do this. I say this because by this point, Paul VI knew there would be a huge reaction if he reaffirmed the church's teaching. He knew there was going to be a blowback, in other words. And I don't have time to talk about Paul VI's character. He was not the strongest of people, let's put it that way. And so it was probably providential if he had people there to sort of encourage him to do this at the time. Otherwise, it probably might not have happened. And so he issues Humanae Vitae in 1968. And I'll go through this briefly. I'm going to show you I'm going to go through some important quotations here just to show you what I mean by this. But the first section of Humanae Vitae opens by acknowledging that there are problems. People have problems, but asserting the magisterium's responsibility to address it. He also claims, by the way, early on, if you haven't read Humanae Vitae, you should. He says that the special commission was not definitive because it wasn't unanimous and went against church teaching, basically. The second part of the second thing about it is that as we'll see in a moment, it reaffirms the church's teaching that natural law and God's design for marriage does not allow the frustration of the process of life, basically. The final, it also ends, by the way, it talks about, toward the end of this second section, about what would happen if contraception becomes widely used and widely available. The final section of Humanae Vitae is basically a plea to authorities, both in and outside the church, to help encourage alternatives to contraceptives, including education for things like self-control and chastity, which in the end didn't go down very well at all. Okay, just a couple of things. Just thought I'd throw you a picture. I tried to share this on Facebook the other day and didn't come through, but Father John Ford passed away in 1989. And by the way, to give you an idea of what's coming after this, when he came back to America, he was a teacher for many years at Weston College in Massachusetts. He also taught in Rome during the 1950s, but he got a sabbatical from Weston to go to Rome, be on that commission. When he came back in 1967, some of his colleagues refused to speak to him. Students stopped taking his classes. He was so distraught by this, he eventually resigned a couple of years later from teaching. So he suffered for his efforts to affirm church teaching. But I'm going to come back to the majority report, the so-called. That's what people call it. But that majority report says several things, just to give you an idea what the ideas that are clashing here in this at a high level, because you're going to have. We'll get this in a moment. I think there's a big distinction to be made between lay people who rejected the church's teaching, rejected Humanae Vitae, and people in the hierarchy and people outside the church in elite circles. Big distinctions. But we're going to the majority report here. Just go through a few snippets from that document. This first passage I've highlighted says, quote, "It is proper to man, created to the image of God, to use what is given in physical nature in a way that he may develop it to its full significance with a view to the good of the whole person." So we're talking about sexual acts, okay? It's not about procreation, we're about following nature, it's about the good of the whole person. They're kind of vague on what that means in this document. It does not then depend upon the direct fecundity of each and every particular act. What they're saying there is the church was wrong before, and that not every act of contraception is wrong. Last sentence, moreover, the morality of every marital act depends upon the requirements of mutual love in all its aspects. Again, there's this emphasis on love as opposed to natural law, right? Next section, from the third section, maybe even more stunning than that one. In this passage, they're talking about the distinction between acts which are contraceptive and acts which are not. Acts which are morally illicit, those are illicit. So when it says, in brackets, those are my words I put in there to make this intelligible, but it says the true opposition, that is between acts that are contraceptive and those which are not, is not to be sought between some material conformity to the physiological processes of nature and some artificial intervention. What they're talking about there is like, what they're basically saying is the distinction between nature and what's natural and artificial is not applicable in the case of contraception. Why? And here's the pull quote here. "For it is natural to man to use his skill in order to put under human control what is given by physical nature." And I'm lingering on this because what they're basically saying is that mankind or humanity is in control of nature, not God, human beings. This is why it goes on to say that opposition between what's morally right and wrong is between one way of acting opposed to a prudent and general fruitfulness, and another which has a concern for education and all the essential human and Christian values, yada yada yada. And don't ask me what a prudent and general fruitfulness is. They're really vague on this. They never specify. The main work being done here is that whether something's good or not should be under the control, not of natural law, not of God's design, but of human power, basically. And finally, this leads to one of the last conclusions in the majority report, the schema for a responsible parenthood. In other questions of conjugal life, there are various objective criteria which are concretely applied by couples themselves, acting with a rightly formed conscience. These objective criteria are the couples. meaning they're the ones who come up with the criteria. It is impossible to determine exhaustively by a general judgment and ahead of time for each individual case what these objective criteria will demand in the situation of a couple. In other words, basically the couples themselves get to decide what's right or wrong in terms of something being illicit, in terms of contraceptive or not contraceptive. Basically, it's all up to the couple, in other words, which, by the way, that was exactly what pretty much every Protestant denomination had come to the conclusion of a decade before this. I'm putting side by side with the majority report to show you what Humanae Vitae said and why. And you can read it for yourself. This is the big takeaway, two things. This is from section 13. To experience the gift of married love while respecting the laws of conception is to acknowledge that one is not the master of the sources of life, but rather the minister of the design established by the Creator. Just as man does not have unlimited dominion over his body in general, so also, and with more particular reason, he has no such dominion over specifically sexual faculties. For these are concerned by their very nature with the generation of life, of which God is the source. In both, I know in Casti Connubi, but I think also in Humanae Vitae, they both appeal to Genesis. The very first command given by God in the Bible is be fruitful and multiply. And so, again, this is a clear rebuttal to me in terms of what you just read in the schema in the so-called majority report. No, human beings aren't master of nature. God is. That's why they have to follow their laws. Again, each and every marital act must of necessity retain its intrinsic relationship to the procreation of human life. Any action which is either before, at the moment of, or after sexual intercourse is specifically intended to prevent procreation, is deliberately contraceptive, and so intrinsically wrong. Right. And so that's the rebuttal, basically. So what's the fallout from all this? You can kind of see, I'll show you, I thought I'd show you a few things here. This is from the front page of the New York Times, read the front page when he published it July 25th of 1968, Humanae Vitae. Wasn't made public until July 30th. The outcry was immediately, this is July 29th actually, so they got ahead of it. Pope bars birth control by any artificial means, takes note of opposition, yada, yada, yada. Dissent is voiced. You can see where this is going. There were lots of editorials by lots of people, clergy, laymen. This one in the tablet, I can't remember the guy's name. It says here. This is, yeah, I'll get to the lay editorials in a second. They were very, very, there's a lot of anger, to say the least, toward Paul VI. This is a protest on behalf of Charles Curran at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. Why am I putting this here when it's 1967? Charles Curran was already one of the people who was pushing for the change in the church teaching before Humanae Vitae was released. He was actually sacked by CUA in 1967. But there were a bunch of protests, is what you can see here, of not just laymen, but of course there are nuns. You can see priests in the background here. They got him reinstated. And eventually, by the way, well, he became one of the major primary dissenters from Humanae Vitae when it was issued. This next one I kind of like. This is from Germany. I think it was some sort of couples, sort of family life thing in Germany, Catholic family life thing. Married couples met to protest Humanae Vitae. I think I pronounced this right. Sich beugen und zeugen, which translates submit and procreate. So people were taking this not very well. I thought this was, yeah, the clergy telling them how to live their lives, etc., etc. And then finally, this is weird, but some levity in a very heavy subject. But that is a protest by women outside in The Hague. Actually, The Hague is in the Netherlands, and they are protesting on the anniversary of Humanae Vitae in 1974. Against the Encyclical and the teaching. And if you, I don't know if you can guess what they're supposed to be dressed up as. They're dressed up as sperm. You get it. People were angry is the point, and when they protested this stuff. Okay, finally to what I'm calling the Schism of '68. That's actually not my phrase, by the way. It was a book published in 2019 by a bunch of historians who I believe are all opposed to Humanae Vitae. They call it the Schism of '68. The conservative Catholic writer George Weigel, who's the biographer of John Paul II, called it the Truce of '68. They're kind of both true, but I'll call it the Schism of '68. Pope Paul probably couldn't have picked a worse time to issue the encyclical. There was upheaval across the Western world. There were protests across the Western world and university campuses, students seizing buildings and getting in fights with police and everything else, and armed confrontations, and the Vietnam War was happening, and there was, all sorts of shenanigans. The Soviets invade Czechoslovakia in 1968. Martin Luther King's assassinated. Robert Kennedy's assassinated in 1968. All hell's breaking loose. So in the midst of this global social upheaval, he throws he doesn't throw a grenade. He throws a fast burning log of wood on a fire, and it goes crazy. And the response of much of the clergy, much of the church in Western Europe was one of defiance. Multiple bishops' conferences in Germany, Belgium, Austria, Canada, Switzerland, among others, issued statements either opposed to Humanae Vitae or insinuating that it was not binding on people. Cardinal Suenens, one I mentioned before, Belgian cardinal, asked out loud in the aftermath of Humanae Vitae, quote, whether moral theology took sufficient account of scientific progress, which can help determine what is according to nature. We just knew nature better, teaching, right? I beg you, my brothers, let us avoid another Galileo affair. One is enough for the church, unquote. So he saw this as being on the level of Galileo, which if you listen to my lecture on Galileo, you know he has no idea what he's talking about. Totally wrong. He was also supported by many, many prominent theologians, people like Karl Rahner, Hans Küng, Joseph Fuchs, I mentioned before, Bernard Haring. And if you notice, by the way, the trend of those names, they're all German. Germany is in some ways the epicenter of intellectual opposition to not just Humanae Vitae, but a lot of traditional church teaching to this day. In the United States, a group of theologians at Catholic University issued a document denouncing Humanae Vitae. When they refused to recant, Cardinal O'Boyle of Washington removed their faculties, at least from some of them. Richard Curran, person I've already mentioned before, as soon as, I think the day after Humanae Vitae was actually issued, held a press conference on the steps of Catholic University and told the public that couples could follow their conscience in the matter, and that the teaching of Humanae Vitae was not binding. And this, by the way, will become the de facto rationale for a lot of people, a lot of priests and clergy and theologians after Humanae Vitae, that basically it's not binding and people can just do according to their consciences whatever they like. In September of 1968, during a sermon in which Cardinal O'Boyle denounced dissenters against Humanae Vitae, 200 Catholics walked out, condemning which in protest. The remaining parishioners gave him a standing ovation, by the way. In November of that year, 4,000 people protested outside the meeting of the USCCB in Washington, D.C. in support of dissidents against Humanae Vitae. And interestingly enough, well, I'll have time for that later, but it was this type of open opposition to Humanae Vitae which basically led Paul VI to take a defensive stance with regard to dissenters. When Cardinal O'Boyle removed those faculties from those priests who'd written the document, the Vatican, the priest appealed to the Vatican, and the Vatican told him to reinstate their faculties. Apparently, out of a fear that schism would occur if dissent were strictly punished, and that basically had marked a huge turning point since that year. Basically, the Vatican has never really, except in only in rare cases, basically punishes theological dissent anymore. Mainly for that reason, they're terrified of what will happen in terms of schism. Now, in terms of lay Catholic responses, The reaction among articulate Catholics was, at least in the press, was one of outrage and a clear sense of betrayal. I have to stress this. You can tell from the tone, I don't have much sympathy with the dissenting clergy at all. I have more sympathy with the lay people who reacted badly to this, and the ones even today who reject the teaching. A lot of these people in the 1960s, when you read it, I didn't get a chance to read too many accounts of lay people's reaction to Humanae Vitae, but the ones that do, they are people who sound like people who they tried to follow church teachings. They had big families. I think they felt they'd been sold a bill of goods. They thought, again, because you had all of these clergy and theologians saying, yes, the church is going to change its teachings. They thought they had been promised relief from their distress. And they come out, it's not just implied, some of them come out outright and say they've been betrayed. It's amazing how many people from that era used the phrase, basically accused Paul VI of harming people by issuing the encyclical. It's that personal to them. In France, for example, to give you an example of this, 3,000 women sent letters to a Catholic women's journal between 1968 and 1969. A lot of them expressing disappointment with this. Some of them argued that they found it impossible to say no to their husbands when they wanted to make love, and they were afraid that denying them would push them into adultery, stuff like this. And so you get sometimes these heartfelt responses to this stuff. However, by the way, in that batch of letters, you also had some older women defending the teaching, so it wasn't all against this. And I should mention, by the way, despite a lot of real anger, there was some astroturfing going on. After Humanae Vitae was issued, just give one example, Hugh Moore, who was a businessman and population control activist, he founded the Dixie Cup Corporation. He was also one of the founders of International Planned Parenthood, and he took out full-page ads in the New York Times and other newspapers denouncing Humanae Vitae. He publicized and organized petitions from dissenting priests and circulated anti-Humanae Vitae material and sent it to bishops, translating it into Spanish and French. So not all of this, by the way, was spontaneous, though a lot of it was. And finally, we come to the dissent of theologians. In the following years after Humanae Vitae, many theologians unhappy with it would promote theories designed to get around the ban. Probably the most important of these persons is Bernard Haring. He was on the Papal Commission in the 1960s leading up to Humanae Vitae. He was one of the people who pushed something called the fundamental option. What is the fundamental option? This is the idea that, I'm dumbing this down, but it's the idea that not every single act has to be immoral. In other words, I'm dumbing this down, basically means as long as your heart is fundamentally oriented toward God, you can sort of like, certain individual acts don't have to be considered sins, basically. I'm dumbing this down, it's kind of confusing anyway. But it was a way of basically saying that not every act has to be intrinsically immoral with regards to contraception and other things as well. I should point out, by the way, Humanae Vitae had its defenders. I mentioned Germain Grisey, he was one of his prominent defenders. Dietrich von Hildebrand was a German theologian. Joseph Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict XVI, Karol Wojtyła, they were all published defenses of Humanae Vitae over the years. But on the whole, for the next couple of decades, from 1970 to the early 1990s, Humanae Vitae was a dead letter in most seminaries. A lot of places wouldn't even teach it. A lot of places would just sort of out of hand dismiss it, say it wasn't binding, and say it's going to change. So this is what the legacy of dissent and opposition within the seminaries. I'm going to leave you. I'm going to stop with one last chart to end this. This is from a study by Father Andrew Greeley. If you don't know who Andrew Greeley was, he's a priest. He's passed away now. Father Andrew Greeley was a priest, but also a sociologist. And he was someone, by the way, who wanted the church to change its teaching. But this is a study from 1963, which, if you can read the title on the side here, says The Sexual Revolution Among the Catholic Clergy. And it was based on a survey of over 5,000 clergy in 1972, I think. And it measures attitudes toward contraception before and after Humanae Vitae. And I've highlighted 2 areas here. This is something you can see the breakdown, and we'll go into this, but lists attitudes, and attitude A is all contraception is morally wrong because it's forbidden by natural law and by the church. Before Humanae Vitae, 75% of bishops agreed. After, 70% of bishops agreed. So not much change. Take a look at diocesan priests before and after. Before, 40%, and only 40% believed that this was true or agreed with this. After, only 29% agreed with this. You go to religious orders, the superiors. Before Humanae Vitae, 46% of people believe the attitude A. After, only 34%. Go to priest, it goes from 39 to 29. And you take a look down at the bottom, attitude E. Judgment concerning the morality of artificial contraception should be left to the responsibly formed consciences of the individuals involved. Again, bishops before, only 7% believe that. After, only 11% believe that. So the hierarchy in 1973 was still fairly conservative. What was opposed was, of course, the clergy. Before Humanae Vitae, only 22% of diocesan clergy would agree with that. After, it's 32%. Go to religious superiors, same thing. Before, 14%, up to 28, 20 to 30, you get the idea. The cohort of priests about 10 years before, who were ordained 10 years before and 10 years after Humanae Vitae, led a shift in the church. These people, these clergy are now, of course, bishops and cardinals and running dioceses, and they're the ones whose attitudes shape the church today. So Humanae Vitae was an epic earthquake within the church. And so that is the end of the lecture. Title lecture is Humanae Vitae, Catholics, Contraception, and the Church in Crisis.